Hello. I've been on Facebook a considerable amount, posting on climate and various issues. So my name is Jordan Wallace, and I don't have a professional, what's the word for that, category whatsoever. Just interest and curiosity. The title here is Municipal, with macro scale continuity from municipal perspective. And one of the reasons I wanted to put some of my concerns forward was that more often than not, the municipal credit, where there's moves, right? So if we consider risk and we consider climate change, look at security environments and how that rates continuity for business and various direct impact issues. On the other hand, there's also larger concerns for agriculture, regions and precipitation, also indexes for how dry the humus layer is. So that's the surface of the above the soil, various kinds of decomposing materials that can be dry and can be a fuel source for fire or also carbon release. Pressure from communities that are well integrated with their natural environments is an early warning system. It's not something to be derisive of, because if life relates to uh, structures of knowledge that help us understand our situation, security grade as an isolated uh, normalcy isn't necessarily always the best awareness for policy advance. Okay, I sent an outline out to various people. One of the things I always consider when I'm sending something out is uh, uh, how does it augment their knowledge of various situations as they may be, or structures. In this case, it's structural economics. So just an outline. Wanted to look at a few things. Aggregate distribution and program funding, deployment funding, as it's time to abatement of carbon emissions. How diffuse is that distribution? How focused is that distribution? What is the, as we select individuals in our process of distributing funding or developing programs, how do we make sure that we're getting 100% result from what we put forward? I'm very strict about retaining optimums. Surprisingly, early retirement comes into play. Not so surprising. Agricultural pressures make for beneficial logic towards retiring carbon sources as a form of stoppage in process. Issue orders or issue systemic notes. Here's what it is. Community perspective, so psychological and legal distribution. Distribution as disposition is a newer technique, and it's used in risk, in environmental data. So it can be used for any form of data, but GIS and distribution for various decision research capacities is important, and it integrates well with, or you can have kth distributions with how that's timed to diffusion or distribution, aggregate distribution of funds. Deployment funding is the focus for carbon abatement. There's no escaping mitigation. If we become enthralled with impacts or adaptation as a funding focus before we solve the primary issue, which is carbon emissions, we get stuck in so there's such a thing as peripheral closure, where people don't see themselves being successful with issues in the central space, and then they lose touch with what their impact needs to be on behalf of their communities. We can't have that happening. So don't feel alienated by central decision-making process. And so that's why I wrote out this outline and sent it in. So municipal credit, deployment rate, supply chain. And that's a timed process where we discover what we need to accomplish a process. This has to do with project managers. Okay, if you're dealing with staff and you're dealing with clients at the same time, if you're dealing with funding, if you're dealing with all of those various issues, to make sure something happens and it's always in your court, have support networks for contingencies should they arrive. Have the support there so that you're ahead of the game throughout your scheduling. So aggregate regional policy, aggregate regional policy structure, federal, national. So what are the central decision makers saying to us that's sufficient and timely as far as carbon abatement goes? So how can we make things better? How can we support central decision makers so that it's not all just dissatisfaction with desire? It's also opening space for comfortable process with real criteria. Aggregate quantitative easing. So this is a new concept for some people. It's something that I have not seen anywhere else. It's something that I advocate. If we're taking money out of certain processes that are carbon intensive and we're putting them into renewable energy, and that's what needs to happen. So all of this policy resistance to earmarking, that's a carbon tax issue, but how do we get it done? And if there's not a attentiveness to funding balances whatsoever, so the choice is obvious. But historically, this has been a trigger issue. Want to get through it without any lumps. Okay. So aggregate quantitative easing is a process by which there's support for any economic elasticity interval as computation, whereby movement is calculated to happen smoothly without flight or shocks. So it's something that you can do in real time to avoid negative results. So funds transfer as policy. So where are we putting the money? And do we need to rely on things like special drawing rights to have enough soon enough? These are just. This is not a. I'm not a credentialed observer, but for what I can come up with, from what I've studied, and I have studied a fair amount, this is what intellectual versatility, I would say, is positive. So, fiscal structure. Is there anything that needs to be looked at for now? This is a gray area for me, and I'd enjoy comments or feedback on fiscal structure because it's one of my uh, least studied areas. But interestingly enough, wondering if bonds or release of funds that are isolated from inflation could uh, acquire. So value, whereby uh, carbon abatement is, either a green bond or something. How are green bonds? Uh, uh, I'm not sure what the functionality is there, but somehow a way to avoid have the scale for what's been suggested. Very good paper, OECD paper, technical note on for transition. So this is what BlackRock has come up with as $40 trillion of renewable energy deployment. And I think that's a global figure. If it's that scale, what are we doing to avoid inflation? So how is that structurally functional? Is a question of mine. So abatement, retirement, stoppage. If there was a defense order to shut down a facility because it was carbon intensive, it would probably surface as policy because when you're in a certain space with computation, for sure what your minimum is to abate on time with natural system stability. Commitment, we need to know for sure, and in some cases this is in the past, unfortunately, but when T0 arrives for carbon that can't functionally enter natural system state. Okay, so price pressure and public velocity. So fuel prices, and on the other side, on the impact side, there's agriculture, and if they're spending a lot of time buying equipment for irrigation, then there's expense there. Real estate. How does real estate compete with industrial consortium as a value difference if at the low end of the scale people are unable to afford common amounts for lower rental income space, and how does the time consideration take place where people are well aware and spend the extra time other than just work life to support their communities in validating energy transition if they think it's important. So a better diffusion at the same time, how's the value and optimum? How are these people actually making changes in their communities? So household income, of all of the, so there's uh, different grades for household income in some of the IMF modeling, and we need to know more about uh, stability before we make big changes. Uh, that's my issue. I don't know enough about granular, what the granular data results are, and how entering into data space with data where optimums are concerned can be a soft space. GDP assumptions and physical logistics. So on the one side, we talk about physical logistics and how hydrocarbons functionalize economy. On the other hand, we talk about GDP assumptions and how most of the global economy is service industry. So by sector, the oil and gas industry is a very small component. However, in common perspective and what has become a socio-technical mini-state for continuity, we think that nothing happens without fuel. Technology, so there's some differences to make there. Economic structure and coupling. So if physical logistics, then coupling between throughput and all kinds of economic or individual decision contingencies that get made that may or may not result in flight or collapse because there's a value difference that hinges on too many other aspects of structure. I understand what that is. What's really important is planning for the change. So it is going to be transition. I'm a proponent of spending directly on deployment for mitigation. I think that's the best way to deal with what's at issue, and there's incredible support for those kinds of decisions. However, becoming receptive to various forms of grading competence or logic, and grading or what's the word for that now? Where we try to effect closure because of irretrievable response. So if we've made the wrong decision before, we need to close because we have to sort of do that again or something. Negative decisiveness, energy transition. Loosening up some of the rules, unspoken rules, where people close themselves off and join fragmented socio-technical silos, where there's sometimes, I think, issues with permission and estoppel, I'll call it. You can do better the next time seems to be a bit of an issue. All right, securitization and lock-in. So we include different things in the same structure as value, and then we commit to value. And how is that a barrier to energy transition? So how do we achieve value separation as transfer, where things like insurance or agriculture or any of these variety of valuable changes in structure become what we're attentive with, and what gets ameliorated as value recognition. So if it's social cost of carbon, how are we gaining access to funds to do the right thing? Some of that's adaptation, most of it is abatement. If we don't solve central issues, we don't get anywhere near solving uh, things like constitutional fidelity. We're supposed to be moving our logic in a pattern right to life issues in every case. That's what state expects as climate justice, and that's what we should be assertive with. Right to life is a function of energy decisiveness. So underscale as timed and induced marginal lock-in. So regionally, there was the purchase of compressed natural gas bus lines. And so this is a 20 to 50% reduction in carbon emissions. As far as I know, compressed natural gas only does 20% less emissions. Some people, it's been widely quoted that certain kinds of technology can produce 50% less emissions than other fuel types. So we commit to not no carbon, because there's lots of companies building hydrogen buses, but we commit to marginal quantity and lock in with that time and that emissions commitment. So if you're in business, figure it out. It's real simple. Carbon abatement. All right, that's me for now. More later. Wanted to talk later about uh, uh, industry support for common initiatives. So series and organizations like the TCFD coming up with policy choices that large groups of entities support. So it's very common for a particular initiative to gain corporate backing if the ideas are cogent and timely. So there's that. Also, there's a few other issues to talk about. Niche modeling, I mentioned in a previous video. If we're doing macro modeling and some of the impacts aren't lining up, the projected and observed, or where there's closure or interpolation, we should know more about niche and how niche as an impact schedule fits in with larger modeling structures. So if we're seeing certain things now, why oh why is there lag as impact awareness? All right, that's it for now, and until next time, it's amazing to be in the public domain. All right, bye-bye.